Hey, my friends, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And do you remember that time in probably like 7th grade English when you learned about foreshadowing and your teachers had you read, what would you do in 7th grade? Like Of Mice and Men? Is that maybe 8th grade, 9th grade? I don't know, some great American novel, something like that. What's the one with Leonardo DiCaprio? The Great Gatsby, maybe you did that one. And then they explained to you that there were things that the author very intentionally baked into the story in ways that maybe slid by you a little bit, but if you really thought about it, it means something. It's like what was it? What's the famous one? No, the one they used in my class was the one with Anne Frank, right? There's the one about the pen, and she had like an ink pen, and maybe it fell on a stove. I don't know, it's been since 8th grade. Then maybe it was burned, and then the teacher was like, well, this is foreshadowing what's going to happen. I was like, oh my goodness, it's morbid and horrifying. And if I just butchered that, you still get the point. Foreshadowing happens in good literature, in awful literature and awful art. The story just careens straight ahead at breakneck speed with no thought for artfulness or flourishes. And don't get me wrong, the reason that foreshadowing exists is not just a flex by the author to be like, I actually thought about what I was going to do at the end, as opposed to the people who made the Star Wars sequel trilogy or Lost. No, it actually does something to enhance the thing. It puts your brain in a mode of thinking about this little simple thing that seems like it should mean so little, but maybe it doesn't take much to extrapolate that out and realize that it means much more. Or maybe that foreshadowing allows a point of view character to interact with a thing that seems inconsequential, and you realize they have one attitude toward it when it's inconsequential and it's not about them, but as the story unfolds, the point of view character looks on that thing when it's now up in their business very differently. Foreshadowing is a very powerful tool, and it's a hallmark of excellent stand the test of time style writing. Look, my friends, how many of these have we done together now? 300 and some odd conversations, you and me hanging out, talking about literally barely half of one book from 2,000 years ago. We've dug deep into this thing, and we've seen foreshadowing, thematic development, motifs that pay off later. We've seen that all over the place. Now, it's very satisfying when you go and watch a show, movie, or you read a good book, and you get that payoff, where this motif actually gives you something. Again, I know every time I bring up Game of Thrones, some of you are like, yeah, you are barely a Christian. What are you doing? You're watching bad shows. Hey, totally respect your opinion. Me bringing up shows you find offensive is not my way of rubbing your nose in it and being like, you should like the same things I do. I respect your convictions. I just maybe come at it a little bit differently. In the course of watching a show like that, you saw season after season of amazing payoffs. The Hodor payoff was incredible. Oh my goodness, the development and the thought. I mean, it was decades in the making in terms of literature and the TV adaptation to make that payoff work. And everybody who was watching that had been following the story when the payoff happened, just had their jaw sitting on the floor, marveling at the artistry of it and the power of what that brought about. That is also why fans hate season 8 so much, whether you're a Game of Thrones fan or not. You've heard how much everyone reviled what they did in season 8. They lazily flipped their storytelling style from thoughtful, artful, nuanced, theme-driven, foreshadowing-driven to runaway train going straight down the tracks with no time for anything on the peripheries, and none of the payoffs happened, and it was absolutely utter trash television because of that. The writing in season 8 of Game of Thrones was more offensive to me than any of the offensive subject matter that I saw portrayed over the course of the entire story. It was appalling, and it stuck out like a sore thumb. So failure to pay off foreshadowing is a telltale sign of haphazard writing, but success in meaningfully knowing what to do with something that is well foreshadowed is a mark of brilliant writing. And we are getting to one of those ever so subtle little flourishes right now in Matthew chapter 14. Herod Antipas is weird and insecure and crazy, and his wife tricks him, and he executes John the Baptist. He murders John the Baptist in cold blood. Then Jesus hears about this, and he tries to withdraw from everybody, but everybody sees him. Like, you're in a boat, you're on a lake, lakes are flat, we can totally see you. I see where you're going, I see what you're doing. And so they follow him along the shore, and then when he gets out of the boat, they're all still right there, and he's like, you know what, just come here. Let me teach you. Let me heal you. Let me nourish you. He had compassion on them. And then, Matthew 14:15, it rolls right right into this famous event. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." But Jesus replied, "They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat." "Well, we have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," Jesus said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people, and they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. And the number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Everybody knows this story. Yes, this story raises all kinds of questions about how this actually happened, where it fits into the larger narrative, and those will be great conversations for tomorrow. But today, we're talking about the foreshadowing element, and this is a foreshadowing payoff. The scene starts with Jesus being put under pressure, trying to retreat, being pressured by more people, and then having compassion on them no matter what they do. This is evocative of what we see at the end of chapter 9. And they got people saying to Jesus, like, "Oh, good miracle, but you only did it because you're in league with Satan." He hears that kind of crap, and then Jesus turns around, and this is where he's at end of Matthew chapter 9. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "Hey, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." He doesn't get mad that they're not getting it and that they're following the lead of people who are willfully, maliciously, violently not getting it. He just cares about them anyway. And then in Matthew chapter 11, he gets into it again, criticizing all of these people, these towns where amazing stuff has happened. And they're like, "No, I'm not into it." But he doesn't write them off. At the end of this rebuke, he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And then you got the passage we're looking at right now, where, again, he's put under pressure, but he can't help but feel compassion for the people. This is his mission. This is what he's doing. He's reconciling broken people with unbroken God, and he's doing so by inviting them to him. He's the gate, he's the door, he is the way, the truth, and the life. And so he's drawing all of these people to himself because he himself is access to the kingdom, is access to this life. He is the providing king who gives people what they need to be sustained and to make it through. And so what I just described is a motif or a repeated theme. Jesus isn't wanting to run off the people. He feels compassion toward the people. But you combine that with what I'm about to read from Matthew chapter 6, and what we have is some straight up foreshadowing. "This then is how you should pray," Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread." Remember that part? And then he goes on later in that chapter to talk about worrying about what you'll eat. And you get the impression that he's holding himself out as a God of provision who provides the true manna from heaven, the nourishment that people really, actually, deeply need. Fast forward back to where we are today in Matthew chapter 14. And what do we see happening? If any of these people who are following him around have been praying what Jesus said to pray, then here he is rounding out that thought. The disciples don't get the prayer that they've been repeating. And so what we see here is one more reason why Jesus needed to keep doing these strategic withdrawals and not just let himself get executed before the time was right. He's still completing these themes. He's still rounding out these points of foreshadowing and completion. Jesus says at different points in his ministry, "I am the bread." Jesus says that God is the ultimate provider of the bread and the nourishment that you need. Jesus says not to worry about stuff like what you're going to eat, because in the end, ultimately, all provision, or even lack thereof, is from God. So all these people get here, and the disciples are, what are they doing? They're worrying. They're on edge about things. The logistics of this aren't making sense to them. And Jesus, just like he was in the boat in chapter 8, is completely chill. "No, this is good. We have what we need to solve this lake problem. No, this is good. We have what we need to solve this eat problem. You give them something to eat." Now look, obviously, we got to come back to that. This is a huge thought. Jesus is commissioning them to do it instead of just completely doing it himself. That means something. Don't worry, we're not going to gloss over that. We will come back to it. And of course, the disciples are like, "Well, we don't have the right stuff to do it." And Jesus is like, "You do now." And then the miracle that we'll break down tomorrow occurs. And what do you know? Everybody's needs are met. Now, this might not have the same smoking gun shock and awe factor that the completion of some foreshadowing in some of your favorite TV shows or books has, but this is meant to be subtle. And you realize that in keeping with the question we should all be asking as we walk down the hill from the Sermon on the Mount with Jesus going through the book of Matthew, that question of, man, that sounded good, it sounded authoritative, but does he have the authority to back it up? Can he really give us this day our daily bread? Oh, well, if you're the attentive reader and that question was still lingering for you, then here you have your answer. Yep, he can. And if he can break the laws of time and space to make that nourishment happen physically out of thin air, how much more so can he meet the true spiritual nourishment needs of anybody who's following him? Hey, a bunch of you signed up to support the program on Patreon. I really appreciate that. Thanks for doing it. It's why we get to have these conversations. Patreon.com/TheTMBH podcast is where you can go to do that if you would like to jump in as well. If you don't want to support the program on Patreon, that is awesome too. Never feel like you have to. I'm grateful for every single person who's a part of this conversation one way or the other. I'm Matt. This is the 10 Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.